Great weekend. Certainly was great weather for most of it. Feels like summer's just about here. So thanks for being here this morning. And so this morning we're going to talk about ego, and it's a big topic. So we won't put even a dent into it today, but it's a good topic that kind of follows on from what we were talking about last week about vulnerability, and we'll relate the two. And please feel free to chat in questions, observations, your experiences if you feel like sharing, right? It's always a richer experience when we're sharing with one another. So the ego. So to take kind of a classical look at it, right? By definition, an ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. To have an ego is essential to our makeup. Ego becomes an issue sometimes when it becomes too big, becomes overpowering, but we all have an ego one way or the other, right, at some level. We'll talk a little bit about how our ego has transitioned from thousands of years ago to today, and how it actually serves the same purposes, but in different environments, like, which I think is completely fascinating. So in today's world, our ego, its primary job today is to protect our self-image. Now, our self-image could be a lot of different things. It could be what we're used to, even in situations that aren't optimal. If we see ourselves as being successful, okay, or if we see ourselves as always being the underdog, or if we see ourselves being in self-sacrifice, okay? The ego preserves what we believe to be safe, okay? And so whatever our images of ourselves, and of course, we don't have just one image of ourselves, we have multiple images of ourselves, depending on, what we do for hobbies and our family situation, and, what's our role in work and all these different things, right? And so the ego kind of has multiple connection points to us, depending on how we see ourselves in various circumstances. All right. So that's today's job of the ego, right? It protects us, protects our self-image of of ourselves, and protects us from vulnerability if we want it to. Now, thousands of years ago, really the ego was meant really for our physical protection. I mean, thousands of years ago, as you can see our little tribe here, it was pretty treacherous, and a snap of a twig in the woods, you didn't know what that meant. So it was fight or flight. Generally, you'd be more apt to take off first and then figure it out later than you would be to stop, turn around, see what it was. And so in a simple way, our ego was really designed to just help us survive. We had less free time for curiosity and self-image. I mean, our folks here in the picture, they didn't come home and look at their Facebook page to see, what the tribe, over the mountain was doing, right? It was virtually 100% of the time was worked on survival. And so the ego was different, right? It was less about the view of myself in the image, like in the previous slide that we had with the young gentleman in the mirror looking at himself. It was really more about survival. Like today I'm going to live, today I'm going to eat, I'm going to try to get food for the next week, right? Whatever the case may be. And so the ego is pliable to our environment that we're in. And so, today we have virtually no natural threats. Now, I'll say parenthetically that, the pandemic, we'll put that off to the side for a second. But generally, we don't have, wolves roaming our streets, and we don't have, marauding, Vikings and things like that, or, Visigoths, coming into our communities and things like that, right? We live in certainly physically less treacherous times. But yet, even in our modern environment, the ego kicks in to protect our modern image of ourselves. See, because the ego doesn't understand the difference in threat. So the ego doesn't really understand the difference between this guy going out hunting and running into this very large saber-toothed tiger, okay, which would certainly be disconcerting, or you going to a meeting and having to deal with somebody who you don't like. It doesn't really know the difference because what it senses is your vulnerabilities, okay? And then that's where fight or flight kicks in. And what happens is that when we feel vulnerable, because the ego doesn't really know the difference, okay, between today and 10,000 years ago, um, it, it automatically puts us into fight or flight, which means we either get defensive or aggressive to protect our position, or flight, right? We run away, and we become submissive, okay? And it doesn't quite know the difference. So like when we talked today about, I was listening to this podcast this weekend about, the environmental stresses that people have and how really toxic they are to the system. And they're not saber-toothed tigers running around, or the lack of food. It's work stress, or commuting stress, or stress from watching the news, right? And things like that. But the body doesn't know the difference, okay? So no different than 10,000 years ago when we were out hunting around for food. We always had to be kind of visual about. Had to have some vigilance around the fact that hey, I'm out here in the woods, doing my shopping, and it's a 50-50 proposition. I'm either going to find lunch or be lunch, right? And we've talked about some of this before. I want to put it in the context about vulnerability now. And so what happens when our ego kicks in, it's there to protect us, but think about it as an anachronism. Think about it as an artifact of our past, okay? The ego is not necessarily useful today, all right? Because we don't have the same threats. So what we have to do is be wise enough, okay, in our own person to modulate it. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to be ego-less. That I would say that might have equal danger, okay? But it's a little bit like working, the sound on your stereo, all right, or on your radio. It's a little bit like working that, because what happens is that we don't need the same ego effect today that we did years ago, okay, many years ago, all right, thousands of years ago. We don't need that, but yet it still exists, and we can get into the brain function and all that. We don't have time for that this morning. And so really it's up to us to have it not be a runaway train, and we can modulate that, because what happens is that whether it was 10,000 years ago, and we're out in the woods shopping for squirrels and rabbits and deer, whatever we were shopping for that day, or berries or nuts, or whether we're going into work, into a stressful situation, or you're working with a buyer who's they're on their 8th contract that's failed, right? Whatever the case may be, our sense of survival kicks in, our sense of vulnerability kicks in. And when that happens, okay, we become less curious, and we become more judgmental, because we're focused on survival, right? We're focused on surviving that moment. Now, thousands of years ago, survival meant a different thing than today. Survival meant physical survival, okay? Today, it's really about how the ego preserves our view of ourselves, okay? It's about the survival of our view. But the way our body reacts, okay, is that the ego doesn't know whether I'm being chased by that saber-toothed tiger, okay, or whether I'm going into this meeting, or whether I'm doing something I really don't like, or I have a family function, that I'm really not all that crazy about seeing my 3rd cousin from Alabama, or whatever the case may be. Nothing wrong with Alabama, by the way. And so it doesn't know the difference. So how do we regulate it? Well, you're the regulator, okay? You're the one that regulates it, okay? It has to put the governors on it so that it works reasonably. And so the next time you feel threatened in any way, know that it's your ego kicking in, all right? Because it's really unlikely. Like when I leave the office in Bedford today, on my way to the car, I'm going to get jumped by a saber-toothed tiger. That's probably not going to happen, right? And so, know that when you're feeling threatened, you're feeling vulnerable, okay, that it's your ego kicking in. And then at that point, you got to take a deep breath and get curious about the reaction. Why am I having that reaction? Really ask yourself, why am I feeling this way? Okay. And once you become curious in that, all right, then your judgment opens back up. Because don't forget, anytime we feel threatened, okay, all right, our vision, like literally, but also figuratively, goes narrow. And we're in self-preservation mode. It's emergency mode. Okay. Now, in extreme circumstances, right, the house is burning down, you're going to go out any window or any means of exit that you can. All right. But we don't have that on a day-to-day basis. Okay. And so when the ego kicks in, we automatically kind of shut down. And then we don't become curious. But that's the best way to find out and analyze, well, wait a minute, why am I feeling vulnerable? Because maybe I actually have really no reason to be feeling vulnerable. And by modulating the ego, right, up and down, you can then, if you dial it back, once you dial it back, it makes room for you to be curious. Okay. Because if you're in a situation where you're feeling vulnerable, really not many of our circumstances in today's environment puts us in situations where we're physically vulnerable. Okay. It's really about how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive our status quo. How do we feel that we're going to be perceived by others? Okay. That's a real point of vulnerability. Okay. So ego kicks in. Remember, it's fight or flight. It's really an anachronism. It's an ancient artifact of your past. All of our past is hardwired in our DNA. Okay. Regulate it. Allow the space, right? So you can become curious about your own emotions and about why you might be feeling vulnerable. All right. So I don't see that we have any chats or questions. So really, it's a fun topic, really, because it gives you the opportunity to kind of like, we're all kind of these artifacts, and it gives us the opportunity to kind of understand, even some of our own DNA, heritage and lineage, that we have technology built into our bodies to protect ourselves, but then how does that correlate to today? And because the environment, right, thousands of years ago was different than today, but yet we still carry the same technology with us. So how do we adjust our own physical, our own internal wiring to be more appropriate for today's environment, where we can be rapid learners, and we only become rapid learners through getting out of judgment and being curious. Okay. So I hope that was helpful today. I think it's a fun topic. Maybe we'll continue with it next week. And if you want to continue with it next week, just shoot me an email, and I'll do a little bit more work on it. Okay. So take care. Have a great week. Good to see everybody.